COVID's Delta variant throughout our region, how it's plunged a number of countries into crisis and lockdown, and the road to recovery. Good evening, I'm Yvonne Yong. In recent months, countries around the world have been ramping up efforts to vaccinate their populations against coronavirus. But even nations which are getting loads of doses into arms are grappling with the more transmissible Delta strain. It can have severe effects. B.1.617.2 is 4 to 5 times more likely to land you in hospital compared to other strains. First detected in India, Delta was responsible for the worst outbreak of the pandemic as the country recorded more than 400,000 cases a day. It spread fast, including to other parts of Asia and the Pacific. Indonesia is now the region's COVID epicentre with nearly 50,000 infections and more than 1,000 deaths every day. Malaysia, meanwhile, is in an indefinite lockdown as case numbers surge, while hospitals in Myanmar are struggling with a shortage of oxygen. Even Vietnam and Singapore, lauded for their handling of the pandemic, are now seeing significant outbreaks of Delta. Closer to home, it's plunged Fiji into crisis. The Pacific nation now has the highest number of infections per capita anywhere in the world.
This pandemic is the worst we have ever seen till now.
Living in Delhi, I can say the speed of this second surge has been nothing short of terrifying.
I have seen whole family vanishing in this train. I have cremated 5 members of one family.
The Delta variant is ripping around the world at a scorching pace, driving a new spike in cases and death.
Jadi memang memerlukan oksigen.
Ya, di bawahnya kebetulan yang meninggal banyak. Jadi di bawahnya tuh bednya, kebetulan kurang bednya.
I lost my uncle and my cousin in a space of a week. Actual treatment, it's really difficult. The hospitals and the health services in the country are incredibly strained.
I would say that this is more or less India situation and maybe could be even worse.
Myanmar's been in a downward spiral since the coup, and now COVID-19 is ravaging the country.
Their family members lining out, in front of the oxygen plant for long hours, and they got a call from their family members that you don't need to wait along anymore, like that person already passed away.
We will continue to work and to do all we can to keep the strain under control and from spreading in our country.
As COVID cases soar in Fiji, its government is coming under increasing pressure to put lockdown measures in place, with more than 1,200 new infections.
I was afraid to come outside because I know I'll get the virus from somebody, I don't know. If you're going to touch anything, you might get it.
The virus has a hold over us right now, and we need to regain control over this virus.
Well, the Delta variant was first detected in Maharashtra, India last October. It's now spread to more than 100 countries and, according to the World Health Organization, will become the dominant strain globally. Peter Drobak is a global health and infectious diseases physician and joins me now from Oxford. Now, Peter, let's go back to when we first started to see cases of the Delta strain emerge. How did it come about?
Well, as we've seen, there are mutations that happen with this virus randomly every time it replicates. And as the pandemic has continued to spread, any mutations that give that particular variant an advantage, tend to see it begin to spread. And so this particular variant, which we first saw in India, as you said, has a particular advantage that it seems to spread much more easily. It's more transmissible than the other variants out there, about twice as transmissible as the original Wuhan strain that we all became familiar with in 2020. So typically, in the absence of any other interventions, one infected person will infect about 5 to 6 other people. So it just spreads so much more quickly. The other features of this particular variant, which have made it particularly difficult to deal with, is that it does appear to be more likely to cause severe disease and has some degree of vaccine escape. So whilst vaccines are still highly effective, particularly at preventing severe disease, they're not as effective as they are against other variants. So even in high vaccine coverage countries like the UK, we are seeing problems with Delta.
And Peter, what evidence has there been of Delta being more deadly than other strains of the virus?
It's a little bit difficult to pick these things out because, of course, we're not catching every single case. And so some of the milder cases aren't going tested. And so we've just seen estimates. But in high and low vaccine countries, we are seeing what appear to be higher estimated rates of severe disease. And those are data from Singapore, from the UK, and from elsewhere. Some estimate, maybe twice as likely to cause hospitalization. I've seen higher estimates that you mentioned as well. It's hard to be precise because we're not studying this in the setting of a clinical trial. We're studying this in real world conditions where there are a whole bunch of different variables. But it certainly does appear to be the case that that particularly those who are unvaccinated may be more likely to develop severe disease.
And in time, can we expect Delta to mutate into an even more tricky strain to cope with, do you think?
It's certainly possible. One of the things that we really have to be concerned about at this phase of the pandemic is that at least in parts of the world, we have high proportions of populations who are vaccinated. And then in the rest of the population, we have the Delta variant spreading very quickly. Now, every time the virus replicates, mutations just happen. They're accidents. But it's like buying a lottery ticket for the virus each time it replicates. So when you have lots of transmission, but a portion of the population that are vaccinated, any mutation that might give it more fitness against vaccinated people or people with immunity already would be a real advantage. So these are conditions that are ripe for the emergence of a new variant that might be vaccine resistant. I can't say that's likely, but it's certainly a risk that we face, and all the more reason for us to step up our efforts to accelerate vaccinations and do what we can to control the spread.
Indeed. And Peter, do we know which vaccines work more effectively against the Delta strain currently?
Yes, all vaccines that have been approved around the world and that have demonstrated effectiveness against other variants do demonstrate efficacy against Delta. Now, a couple of things to note. First is that in those, most vaccines require 2 doses to have full efficacy. In those cases, 1 dose does not appear to provide very much protection. So it's really important to get your full course. Here in the UK, for example, there's been a real effort to accelerate people getting their second jab much quicker than was planned because you really need that protection. Now, the mRNA vaccines, and those are the new technology, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines in particular, have in general demonstrated the highest efficacy of all the vaccines, and certainly that is true for Delta as well. Some of the vaccines, particularly the inactivated virus varieties like the Sinovac and some of the other vaccines that have come out of China, appear to be relatively less protective against the Delta variant. And in Indonesia, for example, we have seen quite a number of reported cases of health workers who had been fully vaccinated with Sinovac who were then developing breakthrough infections with the Delta variant and causing severe disease. So where possible, we're starting to see efforts to move more towards the mRNA vaccines.
Well, the UK has recently lifted restrictions despite case numbers soaring. How do you see the situation there playing out with this Delta variant spreading so fast?
Yeah, it's a real gamble that we're taking here in the UK, and it's one that I don't agree with. The bet is that at this moment, the UK has been very successful in vaccinating the public, particularly adults and those at higher risk of developing severe disease or dying. And it's about 53% of the total population, but most adults now have had at least one, if not two doses. So the thinking is that, Delta is spreading really quickly. It'd be very hard to contain without very severe restrictions, and the government is not willing to impose those on the population. So the hope is that even as cases spread, that the number of hospitalizations and deaths will be relatively low because the vaccines do tend to provide protection against severe disease. So even if you get infected, it tends to be mild. The problem, of course, with that is that there's still a very real possibility that with almost half the population unvaccinated, children and young adults, largely, if we allow uncontrolled spread, as is happening, we're headed quickly towards 100,000 cases a day in this country, that we probably will see pressure on the National Health Service. We are already seeing an increase in deaths. And of course, we're really gambling on the possibility of many more people with the long-term effects of COVID infection, which we're seeing in as many as 1 in 10 people, the risk of the emergence of new variants. This is a really complex moment, and the decision-making here is more challenging than ever. And I think a lot of eyes are on the UK in taking this step. It's unprecedented to relax restrictions in the face of a surging or spiking rate of transmission. I'm worried about what's going to happen here, but we'll all be learning together.
Indeed we will, and we will be looking to the UK as an example of what could or couldn't or might not happen. Delta isn't the only variant of concern at the moment deemed by the WHO. Which others have emerged that this region in particular should pay attention to?
Well, the Beta variant, which is a variant that first emerged in South Africa and has been seen in many countries of the world, is one to watch. Now, Delta's sort of overtaken that in many places because it's so much more transmissible. It appears to be outcompeting other variants. With the Beta variant, the concern there is a higher level of vaccine escape, particularly against vaccines like the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, which is one of the most commonly used around the world. So that vaccine in particular has less efficacy against the Beta variant. So that's one to watch. And there's another variant called the Lambda variant, first seen in Peru, which is similar to Delta but has some additional mutations. And that's not spread as far and wide. We don't know as much about that, but that is certainly one to follow as well.
Peter Droback, thanks so much for talking to us tonight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, Indonesia is extending its emergency restrictions, but only for 5 more days as coronavirus infections continue to soar, fueled by the spread of the Delta strain. The country is now reporting the highest number of new cases a day in the world, even more than India or Brazil. Health experts fear the crisis will only worsen as the surge in cases continues to spread to outer provinces. Indonesia correspondent Ann Barker reports.
Indonesia's most famous dalang or wayang puppet master was a national treasure, loved and admired for decades. Ki Manteb Surasono died this month of coronavirus at his home in central Java. His family had tried in vain to find a hospital with a spare bed. The puppeteer is one of almost 20,000 Indonesians who've died from COVID-19 just in July. Virtually all of them victims of the deadly Delta strain tearing across the country.
In Java, Bali, all the city, like including Jakarta, we find 90% of Delta variants responsible for any new infections.
The rapid spread of the Delta variant has seen active infections in Indonesia soar 5-fold since June to 550,000. Hospitals are overwhelmed and more patients are forced to die at home. Health experts fear a worsening crisis as the Delta variant spreads to outer islands.
If you see the healthcare facility outside Java, Bali is very minimal. It means they suffer a lot compared to Java, Bali.
Doctors and medical workers have suffered the most. More than 115 doctors have died since July the 1st. Most of them were fully immunised with the Sinovac vaccine. Dr. Pandu Riono believes Sinovac may not have been the best choice for Indonesia.
The only way to overcome the new mutants, the new variants that not only Delta, maybe another variants will come out, it means we should select the highest efficacy to give protection for the people.
A partial lockdown imposed in early July has seen case numbers fall, but there's still around 38,000 a day. The emergency measures have kept many Indonesians at home, though millions of low-income workers like motorcycle taxi drivers can't afford not to work.
What else can I do? We have to earn money. If we stay at home, we don't have an income. So what will our children eat?
President Joko Widodo has promised to continue social welfare payments to those most in need, but many are sceptical they'll receive anything.
If the government asks us to stay at home, they have to give us a financial subsidy. But in reality, it's just empty promises. Until now, I've never received a thing.
Empty shops and businesses threaten an economy that last year went into recession for the first time in 2 decades. It's for that reason the government is resisting calls for tougher restrictions and is already talking about ending the lockdown next week.
If the trend of cases continues to decline, then on July 26, 2021, the government will open it in stages.
Health experts say reopening the economy will see infections soar again, and the government is turning a blind eye. Anne Barker, ABC News.
Well, to the west of Indonesia, Malaysia is also seeing a spike in cases blamed on the Delta variant. So how are the two countries handling their Delta waves? From Jakarta, I'm joined by Irma Hidayana, a public health expert and the founder of the COVID-19 report. And from Kuala Lumpur, I'm joined by opposition MP Maria Chin Abdullah. Ladies, thank you so much for joining the program tonight. Now, Maria, if we could start with you, what comparisons can you make with how Indonesia's outbreak is unfolding compared to Malaysia?
I think that what is happening in Indonesia is something that we are looking at very closely. I believe the government is doing that. We are worried definitely of this Delta variant, but and I hope that, our government will actually react faster, because our healthcare services as it is actually under great stress.
Where case numbers are concerned, though, per 1 million of population, Malaysia does seem to be doing worse than Indonesia. But Irma, the figures in Indonesia are still staggering, with nearly 50,000 cases a day and on the rise.
Yes, true. But we are a population of 30 million. And I believe that we should be able to deal with this much better than what we are doing now. Because it's only recently that we are starting the full-scale vaccination. And even then, it is very slow. We are a population of 30 million, but it's only a third of our population are being vaccinated, first dose. Yeah, and with this Delta variant, if it gets worse, I have doubt. I have really my doubt whether we can actually deal with more cases of COVID in Malaysia, because at the present moment we are under testing, we are under vaccinating, and our healthcare structure is really at a brink of breaking down, because the number of cases is just too many.
And Irma, is that a similar story in Indonesia? What are some of the main challenges your country is facing right now in containing this outbreak?
Well, yes, I think it's quite similar, but Indonesia may be facing more difficult situation right now, since we knew that the transmissions, and then we have the increased number of infection in Indonesia, and we have a soaring and increased a number of positivity rates over the past almost 1 month. I think the positivity rates in Indonesia is always around 40 or beyond 40%. So this is, I think, a worrying situation, and we don't have enough. We don't have a substantial number of people who get the vaccines, and we don't have a full we actually have a full pictures of the transmissions, but as what is happening in Malaysia, we also still have low testing rates. This is very much concerning, actually, and the concern of increased social mixing, social mobility, and then relaxations of public health and social measures. It's everywhere. The government actually over the past 2 weeks have been put a stricter measure, but still it is not a fully lockdown where you can still see people moving around, and the mobility of the people still going on in the center or epicenters of the transmission.
Indeed, because Malaysia has imposed quite strict lockdowns over the past few months. Do you think the lockdowns have been working, Maria?
Seriously, no, because it's not just a strict lockdown. We also have an emergency, which is meant to actually resolve this pandemic, but it didn't. We see the cases rising. And that is really because the contact tracing, the isolation, and then the treatment is just not there. Yeah, and the vaccination is also not there. So why lock down when we don't even have a systematic plan to actually vaccinate the people? Like in Selangor, what the Selangor government is trying to do is to they did a whole round of testing in Selangor, and eventually identify the hotspot. Now they are actually doing the testing again and identifying places where there are high cases, isolating and treating, and also vaccinating everyone that is positive, that are negative. So that should be the way that the national government should be doing, but we are not doing it. And that is why I'm very worried that when we have this Delta virus, we may not be able to deal with it.
And indeed, vaccinations are taking place, but in Indonesia, we're seeing a lot of health workers fall sick with COVID. Why do you think that is, Irma?
Well, actually, first of all, because of the very high transmittable Delta variants in Indonesia, it's very concerning. So it makes so more people are infected by this virus, and then the consequences, we have more cases and we have more patients with severe conditions that needs to get immediate medical help. So that's why they have to go to the hospital to seek for medical help. But unfortunately, specifically in Jakarta, greater areas, the hospital occupancy rate is almost full. And then in some places across Java and Violence, the situation is the same. So that means that it gives us the pictures, the situations within the hospital where the health worker have to face, have to tackle, have to care so many patients beyond their capacity. On the other hand, their own resources actually also limited because so many health workers are infected by the virus due to so many patients are there. And then I think Dr. Pandu Riono explained it, that the efficacy and the safety of Sinovac, it's been questioning, and that's why the government of Indonesia right now doing an extra shot for boosters, specifically for health workers. But we will see this rollout of the Moderna booster for the health workers is actually still ongoing, not like still a very small step, but it started. But we'll see. We have to monitor closely and to make sure that all health workers will get an extra Moderna vaccination. But let me give you one thing. The figures, since our organizations is recorded daily death of healthcare workers. So over the past 1.5 years, we recorded that at least 1,464 health workers have died due to the coronavirus. And this month alone, in July, we recorded that at least 252 health workers died from the virus.
Okay, so a significant decrease there. But you did mention China's Sinovac vaccine, which I understand in Malaysia, the government there is phasing that out, Maria. What has the response been like there?
It's phasing out, it's finishing the stock that is available and bringing in Pfizer and AstraZeneca. But I think that, what is most important is really to actually bring down the numbers is vaccination, and also to complement it with contact tracing. That is a kind of basic that everyone is doing, and we have to actually start doing it as fast as we can. Otherwise, we are facing almost the same problem as what has been described in Indonesia, and I certainly do not want to see us going into that direction in Malaysia as well. But the problem is that presently, our healthcare system is at its weakest. We need much more efforts to be made to actually strengthen our healthcare services.
That is indeed the priority around the world, isn't it? Here in Australia too, to keep people out of our hospitals, those who have COVID-19. Irma Hidayana in Jakarta, Maria Chin Abdullah in Kuala Lumpur. Good to get your comparisons. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Let's turn our attention to the Pacific now, where Papua New Guinea last week, only one patient has been confirmed as having COVID. Tests are being done on other people. PNG had put in tough new restrictions to try to delay the arrival of the strain amid concerns an outbreak of the more transmissible variant would put pressure on its fragile health system. Our PNG correspondent Natalie Whiting has more from Port Moresby.
At the start of this month, PNG introduced new rules for travellers to the country. You had to be fully vaccinated and do 21 days of quarantine upon arrival. The tough new restrictions were aimed at keeping out the Delta variant, which health authorities said was a significant risk to the country. But despite their best efforts, the first case of the Delta strain was detected in PNG last week. The captain of a cargo ship which had travelled from Indonesia fell sick while at sea and had to be brought ashore at Port Moresby for treatment. Authorities say strict protocols were followed for fear he had the Delta variant. That was then confirmed with genomic testing conducted in Melbourne. Another 6 crew members also tested positive for the coronavirus, and 2 of them are being treated in the city's main hospital, the Port Moresby General. We're still waiting to hear the results of genomic testing on their samples as to whether they have the Delta strain or not. Health authorities here say the focus is now on ensuring the more transmissible strain doesn't spread, but that could be tough. And arrivals from sea and air aren't the only risk for transmission. Police along PNG's land border with the Indonesian provinces of Papua and West Papua say people are continuing to cross back and forth despite the border being officially closed. From March to May this year, PNG experienced a big surge in COVID-19, with the number of cases increasing 9-fold. Hospitalisations have since fallen significantly in recent months. But this is the first variant of concern identified in PNG. Authorities are pleading with people to go and get vaccinated. But hesitancy remains a big issue here. So far, around 67,000 people have had at least 1 dose of a vaccine. That's less than 1% of the population.
That was Natalie Whiting there. Let's stay in the Pacific, and Fiji's battle against COVID and the Delta strain is continuing. The country now has more infections per million people than Indonesia, with the death toll topping 100. Lise Movono is a journalist in Fiji. She says Fijians are scared and confused, but also frustrated with how the government is dealing with this wave of Delta.
I think it's safe to say that everyone in Fiji is now a whole mix of emotions. There is, of course, a big pervasive fear in the community. There's still a lot of confusion given that things are deteriorating rapidly and we're not hearing a lot from our government, especially with things that are confusing. Although earlier tonight, the Ministry of Health did give us their first update of the month. There is also a lot of frustration as people continue to call for lockdowns.
You yourself have extended family who have been devastated by the virus and you have a personal story to tell.
Yes, that's right. And in fact, that particular death was only announced in tonight's update. And it's indicative, I think, of the situation here where deaths are happening quite senselessly. In my case, it was an aunt, a close member of the family who was only 32 years old and who contracted the virus and got to the hospital quite late. And so the doctors had to make a decision to save the baby that she never got to see and passed away a few days later, sadly.
Really a sad story. How vulnerable are pregnant women to COVID in Fiji and how are health authorities addressing their needs?
Pregnant women are quite vulnerable, sadly, and confidential paperwork that I acquired over the past few days showed that actually in the Colonial War Memorial Hospital, the main hospital here in the capital, Suva, it is the maternity ward where the most cases are coming from. And so what's happening is that there is a lot of fear in the community over the vaccines. And so, of course, there are a lot of people that are still not coming forward to receive the vaccine. And so what we're seeing now is that pregnant moms are turning up at the hospital quite severely infected by the virus and of course passing it on to doctors and nurses working in that particular area. Now what's happened over the past couple of weeks is that our government has managed to come to an agreement with the government of the United States of America for the supply of Moderna vaccines, which as I understand are supposed to be safer for expectant women.
And you mentioned before that people are just confused about what to do. What is the most confusing in terms of the message that the government has been sending out?
I think the confusion is quite widespread right across this response, but the particular problem areas, as I've seen them over the past 3 months of this particular outbreak, is one, in the area of vaccination. The vaccines were made available well before the awareness programs went out into the community areas, and what we've seen over the past couple of months is a heavy reluctance or hesitancy in the rural area, particularly amongst the indigenous population. Or rather, I should say, the Christian population seems to be where a lot of the hesitancy is coming from. And so there's not a lot of community communications effort working to address that. Secondly, with regards to getting tested or getting swabbed and being able to get checked if you suspect that you have the virus, there's still a lot of confusion over, which numbers to call, and when the numbers get called, they don't get answered. And also, what the protocol is if you have a symptom, whether to call for the government to come and pick you up or whether to find your way to a health facility. And just tonight, the Permanent Secretary for Health and his team clarified that position to say that they're actually no longer testing in the community now and no longer prioritizing the return of results to people outside of the population they think will develop severe and therefore critical conditions as a result of the infection.
And what is the goal in terms of vaccinations across the country?
Well, it looks to be the government's main response or the main strategy is to get 80% of our adult population. So that's 80% of about 580,000 people, which is what our adult population is meant to be. So that's just under 480,000 is the 80% of the adult population that the government thinks is sufficient to achieve herd immunity. And they're hoping to do that by the 31st of October, which is not too far away. And as of today, we're only above 14% in terms of fully vaccinated Fijians over the age of 18.
Lithe Mavono, thank you so much for updating us from Fiji there.
Manaka.
course, the Delta strain has also hit home, plunging more than half of Australia into lockdown. In New South Wales, Premier Gladys Berejiklian is appealing for calm and patience. After almost 4 weeks of lockdown, the latest COVID numbers in the state are moving in the wrong direction. There are 110 new cases, 43 were in the community while infectious. Ashley Raper reports.
A city almost deserted, businesses shut down and record high testing rates. But it's still not achieving the results Sydney is waiting for.
We've been extremely successful in limiting the spread to what we have today, but we need to work harder.
Since the start of the outbreak, it's the 4th time case numbers have hit triple digits, and only half can be linked to a known case or cluster.
Most of them eventually get linked, but there is concern that there are unlinked cases.
Of today's cases, 50 are from southwestern Sydney, while 43 of the overall cases were in the community while infectious, and a further 17 were out for part of their infectious period.
Premier, we're still working towards having 0 people infectious in the community. Our target always is, today I spoke about that 43 number being infectious in the community. That's the number we would like to see at 0 or close to 0.
It remains the aim, but now may no longer be the benchmark for coming out of lockdown. The Premier says it could depend on where people have been while infectious.
If that number is in settings which are low risk, well, obviously we can ease restrictions.
There's no indication when that'll be, 4 weeks into lockdown.
It is a bit tricky because I've got 2 kids, so homeschooling is really killing me.
I just play computer games with my mates. That's pretty much it. Not much difference for me right now.
We're in a holding pattern. The Premier insists we haven't seen the results of the harsher lockdown. That won't come for a few days. So Gladys Berejiklian is unwilling to make a call on whether the current course of action is effective enough or whether there needs to be a change.
Yesterday you said that the green shoots are there. Today's numbers don't seem like green shoots. Was that premature?
No. The green shoots are, we have stopped what we call exponential growth. Had we not put in the measures we had, we would have had literally thousands and thousands of cases by now.
But now the restrictions are in place, many might see the measure of success is different. Ashley Raper, ABC News, Sydney.
Well, there's been a jump in the number of COVID infections in South Australia. Late this afternoon, authorities revealed 6 new cases linked to a winery and an Adelaide restaurant, in addition to one this morning, taking the state's total to 12 cases. The Chief Public Health Officer says the exposure sites are examples of super spreader events and described the situation as very serious.
City streets empty and beaches abandoned. As South Australia woke to its first full day in lockdown, it appeared most were heeding the warning.
We'd been out running and run from home and thought we'd grab a coffee on the way back, so didn't have a mask on us, but they were pretty good about it.
Every indicator we've seen so far suggests that people are doing the right thing.
And with a growing list of exposure sites comes more people needing to be tested. For a second night, clinics were overrun, with many forced to sleep in their cars.
It was 14 hours and 5 minutes. I got onto the queue at 10:45 last night and came out at 14:20 today, 2:20 today.
He wasn't alone. Almost 13,000 tests were done yesterday, with most waiting hours.
Since 10 o'clock last night.
About 10 hours now.
Yeah. The people in front of us have a newborn and I'm pregnant, so it's a really long wait.
The opposition's concerned the long lines may have turned people away.
Not only is it awful for those people being stuck in that situation, but it potentially could defer somebody getting a test that could put more people at risk.
Of the 7 new cases announced today, 5 are linked to the Tenerife Creek Winery in Yatalunga and 2 are linked to the Greek on Halifax restaurant.
I would say that both the Greek on Halifax and this winery are examples of super spreading events.
Also of concern, the 2 schools on the list of exposure sites. Westminster in the southwestern suburbs was attended by a positive case on Monday, but thankfully there weren't any students attending. It's a different story for the Gawler and District College in Evanston, which has been closed until further notice. Any student or teacher who was there on Monday needs to get tested and isolate with their household contacts for 14 days.
That will be a massive undertaking to get all of the people that we need to have tested.
Burnside shopping centre's also been added to the list of exposure sites, authorities again stressing the need for people to check in using the QR code system. It's so important they'll be expanding it to the public transport system in coming days.
Victorian health authorities say they're getting on top of the state's latest COVID outbreak. Of the 22 new cases recorded in Victoria, 16 were in isolation while infectious. The remaining 6 cases were in the community but registered very few exposure sites. Here's state political reporter Bridget Rollison.
From the city to the suburbs, the effects of 5 lockdowns and nearly 200 days of forced closures are clear.
I mean, we're human, we're not a machine, you know. It's very difficult, very difficult.
Oakley business owner George Karakoussis has watched many colleagues around him shut up shop for good.
I'm now 63 and I don't know what my future is.
Fish shop owner Jim Samiotis is managing to keep a smile on his face despite not making a profit.
At the moment, I'm covering my expenses. That's it. That's all I want.
This situation, all our local produce, we're just throwing in the bin.
The Victorian government has announced an extra $282 million for businesses affected by the lockdown extension.
As someone who has spent all of my 52 years living in Melbourne, who loves this city, who wants to see it thrive, of course it hurts every one of us.
Cash grants will be topped up to more than $7,000 for pubs and restaurants. Alpine businesses hit hard during this snow season will get another $3,000. Sporting clubs can get a $2,000 grant, while other eligible businesses can claim another $2,800.
This time of year, bookings will be full. Such great snowfalls, the resort absolutely looks great, but there's no one around it. It's actually quite sad.
Businesses not registered for GST will get help to access Commonwealth support.
There are some gaping holes in today's announcement, which means, sadly, a lot of small businesses are likely to go under.
Even with 22 new cases today, authorities are hopeful.
I'm confident that this is going in the right direction. I think we're on track.
Even so, there were more cases from exposure sites, including Ms Frankie, Young and Jackson's and Amy Park. A Westgate tunnel worker has also been infected, while there's been 10 new cases across 3 schools. 3 removalists from Greater Sydney were caught trying to enter the state near Mildura yesterday. They were fined and sent back.
I don't know what it is with New South Wales removalists, but let it be a lesson that if you break the rules, there are consequences.
The Chief Health Officer says if Victoria didn't go into lockdown as quickly as it did, we could be seeing 300 cases a day by now. Instead, he believes we've hit the peak of cases out in the community and expects that crucial number to drop to 0 in a matter of days. Bridget Rollison, ABC News, Melbourne.
Now, as we heard earlier, the first country to see the impact of the Delta variant was India, where a devastating second wave captured the world's attention. In early May, cases climbed to more than 400,000 a day and total deaths surpassed 418,000 now, although experts say the actual tally of those who have died is more likely in the millions. I'm joined by Professor K. Srinath Reddy, an epidemiologist and president of the Public Health Foundation of India. Now, Professor, we last spoke to you in April when India was going through its devastating second wave. How has the country fared since then?
Well, we suffered a very severe second wave, which peaked in May and then took its own time to come down in some of the states and descended rapidly in some other states. So by June, we started seeing the cases definitely on the downward trend in most of the country, and the deaths followed thereafter. But it's not a uniform trend. We find some of the states like Kerala still showing a very slow descent and actually plateauing off. Maharashtra also has had a slow descent, but is now showing a definite downward trend. Some of the states in the northeastern region, which commenced their second wave later than the rest of the country, are still showing spikes, though their overall numbers are not very high. About 10 states in India are now contributing to 90% of the cases, and about 10% of the districts in India are all likewise contributing to majority of the cases. So we are still not seeing the end of the second wave fully, but we are preparing now for a possible third wave.
You are preparing for another spike. You don't think the downward trend will continue? There are very real risks for another spike soon, do you think?
Well, I would say that as far as most of the country is concerned, the second wave has ended. But in some parts of the country, the second wave is still to disappear. And I would say in cricketing terms that even as we are padding up for the third wave, the second wave has not yet declared its innings so far. But we definitely recognize that sometime in the future, we do not know when, the predictions are anywhere from August to October, the country will experience a third wave. We are hoping that our preparations will be much better this time and keep it down to a small ripple rather than a tidal wave.
Are hospitals still being overwhelmed, given there are still around 40,000 cases a day across the country?
As of now, there is no such report because fortunately, the states where we have still seen the plateauing effect, that is Kerala and to some extent Maharashtra, have been well prepared and their health systems have been functioning well. It has been mostly in some of the North Indian and Central Indian states where we had seen the hospital systems overwhelmed, but since the curve is now descended there, the pressure is much less now. But nevertheless, the preparations are going on now to ensure that next time around, the hospital systems across the country are much better prepared with the beds, oxygen, and equipment.
Hopefully a lot of lessons would have been learned. Meanwhile, restrictions, have they been eased significantly? Are people there just learning to live with COVID? What's the government's strategy going forward?
Well, the central government has left it to the individual states while issuing some caveats that states which are showing, or districts which are showing a high level of test positivity rate must still observe considerable amount of restrictions. And some of the states are indeed following that. But in many places, the restrictions have been greatly eased. For example, in Delhi, and with very minimal restrictions, we are seeing a fair amount of crowding. And there's been an unfortunate trend immediately after the restrictions were eased for a lot of people not only crowding the markets in the city, but heading towards hill stations in very large numbers, which brought about a warning from the government. And now some restrictions are being placed on the tourist traffic as well. So we are seeing variable behavioral patterns across the country, which is a cause for concern.
And which vaccines are being administered in India and how effective have they been in curbing the spread of COVID, or is it too early to tell?
Well, we have seen 3 vaccines currently in use. 2 have been in use since January. And they have been the AstraZeneca's Indian version called Covishield and an Indian-made inactive virus vaccine called Covaxin. The Russian vaccine Sputnik V has now started getting administered in some private hospitals, but the volume is not large. But a number of new vaccines are expected to enter the supply chain either by end of July or in August. Some of them are being manufactured in India under license. Some of them have been developed in India and are undergoing advanced phase 3 trials. And if they pass the regulatory test, then by August, we should be in a much better shape in terms of our supply chain. As of now, about 24% of the people have received a single dose, and about 6.3% of the people have received 2 doses, that is as of yesterday. That's still a low number. We still need to ramp up our vaccination rates, which we hope that from August onwards, we'll see much better rates of vaccination.
And just finally, India was the first country to have to deal with the Delta variant. What can other countries learn from its experience?
Firstly, do not be unprepared. Do maintain a vigil in terms of trying to identify the emergence of new variants within your countries or entry from other countries by doing genomic testing of a reasonable number of samples so that you catch the variants early. Secondly, the lesson to the population is whether it is one variant or another or the original virus itself, there are only 3 ways in which it can enter the body: the nose, the mouth, and the eyes. So please do protect yourself with facial protection with masks so that you do not permit the virus in entry, and avoid super spreader events which give the virus an open highway for travel. And meanwhile, vaccinate as fast and as far as possible.
Professor K. Srinath Reddy, thank you very much.
Most welcome.
Let's go to other news now. With Afghanistan teetering on the brink of full-blown civil war, there's a push for Australia to re-establish a presence in the country to monitor the resurgence of the Taliban. The ABC can reveal the Foreign Service is considering sending intelligence officers ahead of a potential return of diplomats just weeks after they abandoned the post. Political editor Andrew Probyn has this exclusive report.
Prayers at the presidential palace in Kabul as rockets fly overhead. One man torn between an instinct to flee and his faith. The Taliban continuing its steady advance through the war-torn country, ever closer to the Afghan capital.
We can all see the violence that's taking place across the country.
A symbolic end to the 20-year war came last week when the US general relinquished command. But Australia had already left, withdrawing a month earlier. The decision to get out made just 2 days after the foreign minister paid a visit to the Afghan president.
The complete nature of the withdrawal took most people by surprise.
The ABC understands Australia's Foreign Service wants to return, initially sending intelligence officers, possibly stationed inside the CIA's headquarters. If deemed safe, diplomats would follow.
It's a matter I've discussed with other leaders, particularly when I was at the G7, and I hope we'll be able to do that at an early opportunity, but only if it's safe.
Given our 20-year role in the country, I think it's appropriate that we maintain a diplomatic footprint there.
With fears insurgents might take the Afghan capital by year's end, one view inside the Foreign Service is that Australia needs people on the ground to establish lines of communication with the Taliban. Some see it as a moral obligation to the millions of Afghans who've already endured decades of conflict, an obligation beyond the evacuation of Afghan nationals who worked closely with Australian forces.
If we have to have facilitated commercial flights to bring them to Australia, I know Australians would support that.
Joining more than 250 Afghan interpreters and their families who've already been given safe haven. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
At least 12 people have died in central China, where severe flooding is causing chaos. Torrential rains lashed Henan province, including its biggest city, Zhengzhou, where 20 centimetres of rain fell in just 1 hour. Dozens of people were caught inside this subway station after the water rushed in. Torrents of water rushed through city streets, with authorities scrambling to recover cars. Many residents were trapped in homes, schools and workplaces, requiring rescue teams to move 100,000 people to safety. Almost 2 weeks after Haiti's president was assassinated, the country has sworn in a new prime minister. Ariel Henry is a neurosurgeon and former cabinet minister. President Jovenel Moïse asked him to take on the job just days before being gunned down. Dr. Henry takes over from Claude Joseph, who'd been serving as interim prime minister. Police have blamed a US-based Haitian doctor for masterminding the attack and hiring foreign mercenaries to carry it out. Rio Tinto has agreed to fund an investigation into the ongoing damage from an abandoned mine in Papua New Guinea. Landowners lodged a complaint with the Australian government against the company, which had to close the mine after violence broke out at the site over 30 years ago. They blame Rio Tinto for leaving behind 1 billion tonnes of mine waste, which is causing environmental damage in Bougainville.
After the company moved out, the levee started collapsing, and then the collapsing levees actually sends down tons and tons of waste into villages, covering farmlands, even untouched forest.
Rio Tinto is also being asked to help pay for rehabilitation work afterwards. It's official, the Olympic Games are coming to Australia once again. Brisbane has today been named the host city for the 2032 Games. Correspondent Jake Sturmer has more from Tokyo, where the IOC announced the decision.
According to the IOC, it wasn't necessarily a done deal, but I suspect that was just to drum up a bit of suspense and excitement for the vote that took place here a short time ago. The reality is that when Queensland was named the preferred bidder earlier this year, it really became somewhat of a fait accompli. Though, nevertheless, the Queensland Premier, the Brisbane Lord Mayor and the Federal Sports Minister have all come over here and they made their pitch. They played up Brisbane's love of sport and Queenslanders' love of sport, the natural beauty of the state and the fact that 80% of the venues for the Games have already been constructed. Let's take a look at the moment Brisbane won the Games.
That the Games of the 35th Olympiad are awarded to Brisbane, Australia.
Well, now we've heard those iconic words, they will be etched into Australia's sporting memory, just like the winner is Sydney. Queensland has now signed the host city contract and Brisbane has 11 years to plan and prepare to get ready for what will be an extraordinary global sporting event.
Jake Sturmer there. Well, that is your world for tonight. Thanks for joining me for this special edition. If you've missed bits, the full episode can be found on the ABC's In Depth channel on YouTube. I'm Yvonne Yong. Have a good evening.